So good afternoon, everybody. We are very excited to have you today in our first speaker series event of the newly established Tech Policy Hub at UMD. I will take a few minutes to introduce the hub to everyone, and then we'll move over to our amazing speakers and the super relevant topic of today about DeepSeek and AI governance. So we have a lot of interested audience in this talk. 154 people have registered. So no pressure, speakers, but people are really interested to learn about your unique insights. And this is in kind of one event in a broader effort of the newly established Tech Policy Hub at the University of Maryland. My name is Ido Sivan Sevilla. I am an assistant professor at the College of Information, and I've established this hub with the goal of bringing together scholars and practitioners from the DMV area who study and work on various tech policy issues. We seek to create kind of an institutionalized space, right, for scholars and practitioners to inform one another on a regular basis, and overall, hopefully improve the tech policy cycles we have in Washington, D.C. We work based on what we call issue networks. It's a known term in the public policy literature. And it's basically a group of experts from academia, industry, government across four main tech policy issues: cybersecurity, consumer privacy, information integrity, and our topic for today, trustworthy machine learning. And I want to share my screen for a moment and show you our website and how is it structured. So you can see the different issues we are focused on. Under each issue, you can see the project, publications from the hub, scholars, people, practitioners affiliated around that topic. And we're expanding those issue networks. So if you're a scholar or a practitioner working on those topics, want to get involved in the DMV area, work on these issues, please email me, and I'll be happy to include you. We're also devoted to improving UMD's tech policy education. So we design and teach classes at this very interesting intersection of technology and governance. We're bringing together social science and computational perspectives on the governance of technology. We use experiential learning classes. This means that we are giving our students real clients with real world problems to solve and hopefully help shape the future industry leaders, government leaders in this fascinating space. We also have a monthly newsletter and an annual in-person event, which will take place at the end of the spring semester in College Park. So if any of these are of interest for you, I invite you all to subscribe here to our mailing list, follow our activities, and stay up to date with all that we do. Lastly, before we move to our amazing speakers, I want to invite you all to our next upcoming event in the speaker series. It's already on our website. And on March 12th, 2 weeks from now, at the same time, we're going to host a panel on how can empiricism improve privacy enforcement. We will host Dr. Eileen Nilsson from Harvard Law and Dr. Mehdi Afraoui from the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority. So if you're interested, please register, and we would love, of course, to have you. Our speaker series events, as I think you now probably understand, are unique by the fact that they're bringing together a scholar and a practitioner to share their unique perspectives on a tech policy issue. So we'll have that in 2 weeks, and we're also happy to have that today as well. Last but not least, I want to say that all of this was not even possible without the tremendous support, creativity, and vision of Hiti Parikh, who has been unbelievable in helping me shape the first steps of the hub. So Hiti, thank you so much for all that you're doing. Okay, so today we're delighted to host Dr. Konrad Kollnig and Dr. Carolyn Saund. They will discuss DeepSeek and what does it mean for AI governance. We will start with Dr. Kollnig and then move to Dr. Saund. Dr. Kollnig is an assistant professor at the law faculty of Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Oxford. He is funded through a competitive AI NED fellowship and leads the RegTech for AI project that seeks to prepare the law for the age of AI. His work on Google's market power in AI was picked up by the US Department of Justice, which now seeks a sale of Google's Chrome browser. In fall, he will release his monograph titled The App Economy, Making Sense of Platform Power in the Age of AI, that asks, how do Apple and Google use their dominance in the app economy from their bottom line, with what consequences for society, and how to respond? Personally, I would say that I'm very inspired by Dr. Kollnig's work. He's been one of the leaders in showing us how we can use tech to better regulate tech. So thank you so much, Konrad, for that. And following his opening remarks, we'll move to Dr. Carolyn Saund. She is a technical consultant at Keystone Strategy. Keystone Strategy is one of our students' clients in our experiential learning classes that I mentioned earlier, and we're very proud to have Keystone as a client. Dr. Saund, she received her PhD in computer science from University of Glasgow, where her thesis focused on generative AI for social behavior. Prior to receiving her PhD, she was a software and AI engineer at social robotic company Jibo and emotional AI company Cogito. I hope I'm saying it right, Caroline. She now advises law firms and government agencies to navigate complex cases with a wide range of implication for the future of technology and society. Her work helps legal teams understand the technical intricacies of AI and data management systems, ensure compliance with evolving regulatory frameworks, and support enforcement efforts in the rapidly changing AI landscape. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. The floor is yours. You both get to discuss, to bring up your take on the topic, and then we will move to guiding questions and then questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, very kind words. I brought a few slides just to share some of my impressions, some perspectives from Europe, some of the things, some recent developments, some you can see my screen, right? Yeah. And some thoughts about the laws that we've been developing in Europe to some of the challenges in the space of AI. To sort of set the scene, well, what are we talking about in AI? It's a lot about information, right? But it seems like, at least to me, for a few years now, we've come ever more to live in a world in which we disagree about basic facts, such as whether climate change is human-made or whether evolution really exists, lots of other things. So we live in an information society, but truth, which is such an important thing for the information society, doesn't really seem to exist anymore as it used to. Science too is under attack, and now we have AI coming into play, and that promises to make major changes, or generative AI, other forms of AI, that promises to make major changes to the information landscape as well. I don't think society grappling with AI is such a new thing. Actually, we use lots of AI tools every day, right? There's Google Search, there's all sorts of social media platforms that have recommender algorithms to show us things. What I find puzzling is that we've been using these tools for 2 decades, if not more, right? Social media platforms, online search. And despite that, we continue to have very limited insights into how these tools work, right? And, keeping in mind that social media, online search, other online tools have ever more replaced traditional media. Nowadays we spend, at least in the US, as much time on social media as we do on television, about 2.5, 3 hours per day. 88% of searches are run to Google search. So AI plays an important role in us discovering and finding information. It seems like this sort of increased doubts about the sort of spread of misinformation, all of that has very much coincided with the sort of adoption of these digital technologies. I don't know if that's gotten so much attention in the US, but here in Europe, a lack of understanding of AI, how it works, what it does, when it's used to when it's used at scale, has significant and real impacts. And the recent Romanian presidential election is an important case in point. Romania is a country located in Europe with about 20 million inhabitants, and people there got to vote on their president in November 2024. Surprisingly, a previously rather unknown independent candidate managed to come first, while polling about 5% before the elections. The independent candidate eventually managed to attract 23% of the total votes on election day in the first of the two-step elections. So they have 2 rounds of elections in Romania. And people didn't really know this guy. People were outraged. Romania came to the verge of a constitutional crisis. Arguably, that still goes on, and trust in institution very much has been shattered. A Russian-funded TikTok campaign is seen as a key driver behind the candidate's success. Obviously, whether the claims about Russian interference are true is difficult to assess for me, but I think, and for others, and I think this is exactly the problem. We still struggle to understand how the social media platforms that we use, fueled by AI-driven recommender systems, how they work, how they influence us. Ultimately, the Romanian Supreme Court decided that there was sufficient reason to annul the elections, and that's what they did. And there's lots of other examples where we use AI systems, not even the fancy stuff like DeepSeek, other things. There's plenty of examples where we use AI systems and we don't quite know how they work. But there's still significant impacts, right? And I think this example, other examples, show how lack of understanding of AI already has real impacts on society. Along the way of their success, social media and online search have really kneecapped traditional journalism, taking away its primary source of income, advertising revenues. In the past, when advertisers used to wish to reach the readers of, say, the New York Times, they had to turn to the New York Times directly. Nowadays, they can buy essentially the cookie of someone who looks at the New York Times and show them ads all across the internet. So the internet and AI-driven technologies have taken away the funding source for independent media. And that matters because studies show that in those places where there is no independent journalism, corruption really takes off. An important force to keep power to account is gone. And it's not just the US, it's many other European countries. We're seeing the death of local newspapers, and at the same time a concentration with a few conglomerates. It's not just the US, it's also France, it's many other countries, and that's concerning, right? And this is not just this is not this is not looking at digital technologies. This is very much looking at traditional media. Now, where does AI come into the picture? Well, I really wonder. We already have such a concentration in media consumption. Where then is AI going to take us? And for me, it seems like we are on a track to see an even greater concentration of control over information. Nowadays, people might look at a few different TV stations and a few different social media platforms. In the future, this might be much less, right? In a world where we only used 1 or 2 AI models, say ChatGPT and DeepSeek, the diversity of information and opinion will suffer. And I put this on the slide. I don't know if that's familiar to all of the people on the call. Maybe it is. These AI models, at least in the pre-training stage, they ingest all of the information you find on the internet, right? But all of these models are sort of, at least to an extent, trained on the same information. And so then at least to an extent, we create lots of AI models that are quite similar, at least in the information that goes into it. So again, this further might lead to sort of this like loss of diversity of thought and opinion. And also this argument, we don't know why what content is shown. It's even more acute, right? We don't know whatever comes out of an LLM. We don't really know how this answer was put together. For example, OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, already provides very limited insights into how their latest AI models are built. The slides that I'm showing are from this image, is from 2022, when they last released insights on the data that they used to train their models. We don't know what data they used. DeepSeek provides a bit more models on what data they used to train their models. But they still don't provide the data. They still don't provide the code. They provide very limited information on the later stages of training, where they do the fine tuning of the model, where they further tune the outputs of the model. And at the same time, these Gen AI developers are left with a huge room to try to influence and sway opinions at various stages of the development of the model. And I think a shocking point in all of that, right? When users don't need to visit websites anymore to get information, the current model of advertising funded websites will be hit severely. And this also takes away the incentive to produce faithful content in the first place, right? If I can't make advertising revenue anymore, if people just use, and lots of my students at the university, they look at ChatGPT in the first place to get the information, right? So we might see significant changes in terms of how the creation of information is funded, and also independent media. And this, as a result, we might make, there's a good chance we further lose independent media and thought. Now, what to do? What to do? And I'm speaking here as a European. And there's a couple of things we're doing. I want to present 2 examples that try to make AI more accountable. The first of them being the EU AI Act, where lawmakers in Brussels thought, well, something we should really do is to try to regulate all AI systems, and that's what we tried with the AI Act. It was adopted last year. It's coming into force over time now. And the basic idea is quite interesting, right? We have a definition of AI, and then we try to group AI systems into different categories based upon the risk, right? And then there's some AI systems that we want to ban. There's some AI systems, high risk AI systems, they need to go sort of third-party assessment to make sure that they are fulfilling the necessary standards to be used in the European Union. And then there's AI systems that may not need all of this assessment, that pose fewer risks, and therefore are subject to a much lighter regulatory regime. However, there's shortcomings. For example, there's a definition of AI under the law, but it's extremely broad, right? There's whole philosophical debates about what AI is, and it doesn't seem like, there still seem to be major disagreements in the EU what it means, even though we have the law. It also seems like there's going to be a huge amount of paperwork that AI companies need to produce, but aren't required to make lots of that publicly available, which undermines independent scrutiny by, say, researchers. So we face issues, we face issues with accountability in the AI space already, and it doesn't seem like the AI Act, makes huge steps in terms of addressing that. And there are many other things that are unclear. So, there's the AI Act, lots of interesting elements very early. Like, law usually gets better over time once you produce a new version of the law. This is one of the first approaches. One thing that I'm much more optimistic about is a more targeted approach, though. And this is what the EU attempted under the Digital Services Act. This is a law that was adopted in 2022. And again, it's got all sorts of different rules and regulations, obligations, I mean, and some of the stringers. So there's a couple of different online platforms that it considers, and some of the most stringent rules apply to what this law calls very large online platforms. That is, online platforms that have more than 45 million monthly active users in the European Union. And they must do loads of things that make lots of sense, I think. For example, they must regularly assess the systemic risks that create from the operation of the platforms, with systemic risk meaning risks to people's exercise of the fundamental rights and freedoms, like right to privacy, right to data protection, right to consumer protection, right to free and fair elections, and so on and so forth. And if there's systemic risks, the platform needs to implement appropriate measures to address them. Another really interesting thing is, and it's, very exciting, that under Article 40 of the law, researchers will be able to request data directly from the platforms to study those risks, to hold platforms for the use of the AI algorithms to account. It's also with lots of transparency requirements, lots more, but it could be a real game changer overall. So I'm very excited about it, but still quite a few details are unclear. So we'll have to see how it plays out. This is my final slide. I hope I'm within time. I think the question that we need to ask ourselves overall is, well, what AI systems do we want, right? And the AI Act, the Digital Services Act, they take steps into the direction of spelling that out, what goes, what doesn't go. It's very hard if the EU is doing that alone, right? I think the executive order on AI was recently rescinded in the US, so that's not so great. And I think this probably chimes with quite a few people in the audience as well, right? Like, just because we can build something doesn't mean we have to. I think later in the questions, I've got a few more thoughts on this as well. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Konrad. These were great, insightful academic remarks of AI and maybe its governance future. If I take away briefly two things from all that you just said, I think it's this loss of diversity of thought. I think this is really something we should all be kind of taking in and understanding, where do we go with this? And generally this gap between the level of our understanding of the problem and the urgent pressing need to regulate the problem. I think this gap creates many of the problems that we see out there. Okay, and now Caroline would like to move to you. Bring us a little bit of the practitioner perspectives on those issues.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I don't have slides prepared. I'm not quite as I don't have quite as prepared remarks, but I'm hoping I can elaborate on some of those themes. I think that largely this group would be hopefully pleased to know that everything that you just brought up is something that we think about often in our work. So Keystone Strategy, the company that I work for, the firm, does strategy work. And then we also do a lot of what I do, which is advising legal teams. So when you think about a big, complicated technical case, as you may have before, like I did before I joined Keystone, there's no way that a lawyer and a practitioner of law can understand all of the technical nuances that are really required to regulate and enforce regulation and understand the complicated systems at issue without the help of engineers and experts. And that's the role that we play. So that's kind of the perspective that I bring into here. So I guess starting off, I very much agree that transparency in the way that AI models are trained and used is very important. I think that the technical work that has been done recently on transparency and explainability is a bit lackluster. Every once in a while, you see firms try to make a splash, particularly Anthropic really prides themselves on explainable AI. Nothing has struck fear into me. I think that there's a lot of chat around existential risk and the existential risk of AI models. And that conversation can get overshadowed by, I guess I'll call doomsdayers, people who have a very Terminator-esque view of the future where humans are all enslaved by the AI. I think that's much less likely and less scary than the reality, which is, as Konrad mentioned, information homogenization and kind of homogenization of thought, which is problematic, but moreover, the erosion of trust. So again, as you mentioned, this idea of people being unable to interpret the output of AI systems critically because they don't really understand what it is. My PhD was in, among other things, as all PhDs are, kind of machine learning. And I'm of the opinion that an LLM is a very fancy bag of words. And that means that a lot of people don't really understand the implications of the factual output of LLM. And that leads to an erosion of trust, not only of technology, but of each other. And this is really, I think that's really the crux of the issue. That is, by and large, the thing that keeps me up at night. And so then when we think about regulation, I'm glad that that you brought up the kind of spectrum of regulation and transparency. I think regulation in the US is often pit against competition. But the reality is regulation exists to spur competition. So you have competitive firms saying you can't regulate us because we're never going to be able to innovate. Example, how can we make a model if we have to share all the data with you, or if we have to collect our data legally, God forbid. And the reality is regulation exists to encourage trust, right? To encourage consumers to trust the output of these systems and to trust that they are made in a way that has consumer welfare in mind. So the way that regulation, in my opinion, is kind of shaping up in the US is, number one, a patchwork. So we don't have an EU AI Act. We had an executive order that was always going to be kind of spotty at best. We have states that have individual laws that govern certain aspects of AI systems. So for example, data privacy. Some states have very strict data privacy laws that are based on GDPR or are based on elements of the EU AI Act. And you have other states that have zero privacy laws. And the philosophy there is, well, consumers don't care about privacy anyway, right? That firms don't have to compete on that basis. So people are recycling old laws in some cases. So there are biometric privacy laws, for example, in the state of Illinois, that were meant to protect people's physical data, and now they're being used on protecting people's digital fingerprints. So we're kind of trying to recycle things that exist. And you see this as well with copyright. So talking about the type of data that these models are trained on, one of the reasons that people say we cannot share that or we cannot disclose it is because, number one, a lot of it was collected illegally, and that is being borne out in the court right now. Or it was collected legally, but the firm that collected it benefits from a data moat. And so another kind of area where we see regulation versus competition, at least a rhetoric around that, is around the access to data. This is something that there is not an answer to. I think reasonable minds may differ on whether or not firms can compete with the current access to data that exists, whether or not you want to believe that that data was collected righteously or not. You need high quality data to train a high quality model. And who has access to high quality data if you have to pay for it? Only big firms. So that's an argument that it might reduce competition. So right, there's an argument that regulators should make people share their data, or should alter existing laws such that high quality data is easier to access. And then another kind of element that comes up is whether or not models should be open sourced. So first of all, right, open source does not mean the same thing for models as it does for code, as Konrad mentioned. Often it does not include the data. It often does not include the breakdown of the data, right? It means model weights. It doesn't include the source code most of the time. As you mentioned, right, you're lucky if it includes all of the training processes. So open source is not a regulated term, right, a protected term. But there are arguments for forcing companies to publish their weights, their model weights, so that others can innovate on top of them. In the US, the climate is generally pretty strongly against that, right? You shouldn't make people share their proprietary outputs. And again, you get into this issue where often we're trying to put existing IP laws into the AI space, and that is kind of a square peg in a round hole most of the time. And the reason that all of that is relevant, that we're recycling these laws, is because the US is largely regulated by case law. So when a law comes into effect, this is a dramatic oversimplification, and I am not a lawyer, but when a law comes into effect, it only matters once it's challenged. And that is where actually the contours of the nuances and the technical sophistication really start to matter. And I'm actually pretty impressed with the way that I've seen the courts handling these cases so far. I think that there is a pretty strong appetite and level of sophistication from regional and federal judges to get this right. I think that there's a lot of pressure, and people understand there's a lot of pressure. And again, I think reasonable minds may differ, but overall, people are aware that this is a really pivotal time and every decision matters. I think thinking a little bit about some of the knock-on effects of these AI systems and regulation doesn't always make it into the law or the courts. So Konrad mentioned a loss of independent journalism. That's pretty clearly tied to copyright law, pretty tied to generative outputs. I think other things that come to mind for me that we sometimes discuss are environmental concerns. I think those are very rarely discussed in the context of regulation. I think partially because environmental concerns are so ubiquitous that they often lose their power. And I'm not really talking about the energy that it takes to train a model. I think that is something that exists and we've kind of absorbed. I'm more talking about the future projections and the impact that that will have on the energy market. I'll very briefly digress. I think a great metaphor for this is when the automobile came along, everybody was like, this is going to change everything. It's going to change transportation. It's going to change work. But one thing that it really changed was public health, because you didn't have horses in urban areas. And that's not really an effect that we think of when we think of the automobile. I think that there will be a lot of similar things in the AI market as AI continues to have investment and grow, right? We think about labor concerns, we think about environmental concerns, but we don't necessarily think about the energy market and where is that energy going to come from? Who's going to pay for it? That's something that I think we can discuss later as well. And then finally, what should regulators do about it? I don't have a particularly strong opinion here. I should also have prefaced, I'm speaking from my opinion. I'm not speaking for Keystone. But I think that where I come down on is it is very context dependent. So I think the EU AI Act regulating at the application level rather than the model level is very strong, right? So high risk applications. I think that there's just a lot in the EU AI Act that we should be learning from. I think that it is really, really problematic that the US is a patchwork of regulations. And you do see alignment, right? You see alignment for some very severe cases, like I think there is a federal law against deep fakes and malicious uses, like obviously malicious uses, but there's no federal law against, for example, misinformation or very limited discussion on privacy. And in the US, that's concerning because AI is at risk of becoming politicized, which of course is, again, kind of without getting into details, is going to be problematic because people won't be arguing about the technology, right? If it becomes a politicized issue, then I don't think there's much hope of unity on the national level, which is really what we need, because the big AI firms that we're talking about, Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, they're global firms. They're based in the US. They should be litigated in the US. They are litigated in the EU where they're relevant, but they're global firms. And I think that we need to start acting like it. And I would like to see more unity in that space.
Okay. Wow, Caroline, thank you so much. You know, we hear all the time that AI is everywhere, but I think your comments actually show and demonstrate the various issues and kind of the array of problems that AI is bringing up. Transparency and explainability, this, notion of AI as an existential threat, the erosion of trust, which is huge in so many institutions that now make decisions based on AI, and the issue of regulation for competition and who has access to the data, and what, this race towards AI what kind of market this will create. Going back to Konrad's point about the increasing centralization of the information ecosystem, which is a big social problem. One comment I have to make about this, the saying that consumers don't care about their privacy. I know that's not you saying that, but we hear that all the time from those companies, and it's just, I mean, research shows that when you ask consumers the right questions about, how data flows are actually going to be used by the data collector, by the data processor, they are objecting each and every aspect of data monetization. So when companies, and companies like to hide behind that, right? The privacy paradox, right? Your behavior is not really a proxy of how much you care about privacy, because what's happening with your data is beyond your cognitive ability, and we see that time and again. So if clients tell you that, please send them to us.
Absolutely. And I will say as well, I have seen in more courts admit as admissible evidence and persuasive evidence, as an evidence that actually persuades a jury or a judge in bench trials, of those kind of surveys and people stating their concerns rather than their behavior for exactly that reason. And the fact is, we live in a society where a reasonable person cannot opt out of data monetization. There are techniques that people can use, but they are inaccessible for the vast majority, or they are, right, people are apathetic because they know their data is being used, harvested, sold, but are completely unaware of any method that they can reasonably use to stop it. So totally. Yeah.
Right. And I think your point about the fact that judges are now, trying to make this right, and they kind of try to rise up to the occasion, to the moment. They understand it's a big moment of decisions about AI, given the case law doctrine in the United States. I have to say I'm a bit skeptical. We saw what judges are doing in the context of government surveillance. We saw their decisions in the context of privacy, and it didn't end so well for society. So I'm not generalizing here, but we should be very cautious about non-technical decision makers making decisions with, such an impact on our lives. Okay, I see that two of you already posted questions in the Q&A. That's great. I promise we will cover at least most of them, depending on our time frame. We will run until 2:30 here, so 45 minutes from now. But I would like to kind of kick us off with guiding questions to both of you and going back to the context of DeepSeek and what does it mean for AI governance. And maybe we can start with just a little bit kind of introducing the issue. So the US president called DeepSeek a wake-up call, right, for US companies. And maybe to kick us off, do you think DeepSeek introduced really novel challenges to the course of AI development in the Western world? And Connor, we can start with you.
Sure. I think one element that and Carolyn picked it up, right? You can't really move the needle about laws in AI in the US because you don't want to harm innovation. What I find really interesting is that DeepSeek emerged in a highly regulated space, right? DeepSeek has been highly regulated, partly through restrictions on things you cannot say in China, but also in part due to US trade restrictions on chips, right? DeepSeek managed, and it's like from an engineering point of view, it is really impressive that they managed to, well, they used older chips for the AI training, and they did a really good job at using these chips up to the maximum capacity, right? If you have lots of funding, as we seem to have in the AI space in the US, that doesn't really matter. You just throw more money, more compute at it. In China, there have been restrictions on chips going to China. But still it was possible to build AI models with those chips that cost much less to develop and in terms of performance are on par with what we see in the US. And that is very impressive, right? So you maybe, I don't know, I think there's generally quite some doubt about whether these restrictions on chips towards China are working out as one was hoping. And then on the topic of Chinese laws, right? DeepSeek has operated in an environment that is very, very restrictive with regards to information flows. And in fact, and this isn't talked about so much, China was one of the first, if not the first, countries to regulate AI, to regulate generative AI. In early 2023, they adopted one of the first, if not the first, law regulating AI, focused on generative AI, and one of the core principle was that the AI has to adhere to socialist values, that you're not allowed to subvert state power, overthrow the socialist system, harm national security interests, which makes a lot of sense in the Chinese context, where you're very focused on sort of some form of social harmony, right? You don't want protests or whatever. There's very clear ideas, relatively clear ideas on what you can say and cannot say. So these are quite broad restrictions, right? You're not allowed to harm national security interests. That's very broad restrictions. And even though these rules are blurry, even though there's such restrictions, they've been able to innovate and build these things. So I'm deeply impressed. I think this is the greatest example of AI regulation does not have to be in the way of innovation. In fact, it can encourage it, right? Encourage companies to, say, produce more efficient models, as they did in the case of DeepSeek. And I hope it actually is a wake-up call to US companies. We shall see. We shall see.
Thank you, Konrad. This is such a good point because we heard that innovation argument before, right? We heard
Yeah.
companies saying, don't regulate privacy, it's going to hurt innovation. But in fact, we see, in reality that regulation can actually increase innovation. And this is something companies don't like us to adopt as a paradigm. And it's very interesting to see this in a comparative perspective, China vis-a-vis US and now the EU.
And I guess also
Yeah,
on the term of, say, environmental impact of some of these models, right? They managed to produce more efficient models due to limited, because of the ecosystem, right? So also AI that is more environmentally friendly definitely, well, appears to be possible. It just isn't a priority.
yeah.
I'd love to
What
jump
do you
in.
think? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to jump in on the technical capabilities. So I agree it is very impressive. And I also agree that the fact that this emerged in a highly regulated space is a demonstration of the like very capitalist viewpoint that pressure encourages innovation. And we're often saying, oh, competitive pressure, but it's like you can have pressure from all sides, including consumer protections, for example, or privacy regulations, or rather AI regulations that say that you can't harm the interests of the Chinese government, right? So I agree it is impressive work. From my understanding, that in terms of the technical leap, it is, in my view, kind of pretty neutral that it came out of China. Like, I think that if you look at the rate of progress, this is kind of on par with what we would expect. Models getting more efficient, which again is good for all the reasons that you listed. And I think that they did emerge in a constellation of factors that is demonstrative of kind of wider implications. But the other thing to note is that they did use reinforcement learning, and it is, I know, and this is not necessarily conspiracy theory, but they did query OpenAI's model to use reinforcement learning to refine their own model. So the training costs that they report are likely underrepresentative of the actual training costs to build the model. So I just wanted to that's my understanding of the actual technical leaps. I do think the chip implications are very strong and very interesting, especially when you look at it from a geopolitical perspective. And in terms of, is it a wake-up call? I think that it's kind of the rate of progress, but if it is something that got regulators and the US government very interested in this space, especially for example, national security reasons, or this kind of US-China tension, like tech competition tension, I guess maybe like you and I, and we were all, this audience was already awake, but if it woke other people up, then like amazing, excellent, that's great.
That's super interesting, Carolyn. I actually haven't thought about that, right? Because we tend to look at those LLMs as a threat to copyright because of the data scraping and how they're training their models, but it might be also a victim, in this case of DeepSeek, to copyright violations. I would be happy to get your kind of comparative perspectives on the harms here, right? So DeepSeek, introduced LLMs that are cheaper, large language models that are cheaper, but at the same time, right, they might advance, like you said, Chinese propaganda. They might be biased and might, promote certain values over others. They can create new risks of foreign surveillance if we kind of, inject so many queries into China-based servers. Do you think we actually have a way out of these harms? I know maybe it's a big question, but do we have a way out of these harms in a world that is going to be increasingly dominated by those LLMs? And secondly, and this is a great argument I saw from Gadi Perl from Israel, aren't US-based LLMs actually introducing the same exact risks of security and propaganda and privacy? Or is it any different? What do you think?
I can start on this one. I am really happy to get this question. I think that they are very similar, right? There's a long history of misinformation affecting geopolitical outcomes. Famously, 2016, Cambridge Analytica, before Gen AI, data scraping and user profiling and like very targeted misinformation. One thing that also comes to mind here is people will argue, oh, well, you could already spread misinformation, so we shouldn't regulate AI. We shouldn't regulate the outcome of AI. Obvious to me, very obviously, the scale is different, right? If you can reach 1 million people with the same effort it used to take to reach 100 people, very obviously, one of those things is more of a threat than another. And I think that that step difference is really important. I don't foresee, without comprehensive regulation, I do not foresee a big difference in the way that these models are spreading this risk. Again, I think my perceived biggest threat is the erosion of trust between each other. And I don't know. I think that besides saying we need to regulate at the application level, the idea of regulating algorithmic output for speech specifically is really, really, really dangerous in the US. It's a powder keg that nobody wants to touch. I think that where you might be able to get in is regulating, or at least kind of emphasizing the competitive pressure of accuracy in the big firms. So Google wants their answers to be accurate. That's kind of a truth that is maybe not like the most true thing, but is pretty true. It's more true than for Meta, right? Meta has kind of come out as saying we are less interested in what is factually accurate and more interested in what people are saying. Sure, that's their prerogative. I think that the way out could possibly be through social education and kind of community education. That is not a way that I think has actually been tried on a real national scale. I think it's a bit of a pipe dream, but I'd be interested to hear, Konrad, what you think, right? I think these risks are real, and I don't know what to do about them.
Yeah, but maybe to give we can talk about these very big risks, but I always struggle with putting these big risks sometimes struggle to really grasp these big risks, right? Maybe a simple example where there's a genuine risk, and it plays into this China versus US comparison, which LLM to trust. And I think it depends, there might be different incentives, right? And then it depends on which incentives align more with what you're interested in, right? And to give an example, right? If and lots of my students use, as I said, use these LLMs all the time to get information. And say I'm in a new city, I'm interested in what is the best pizza place in town. And I get if I ask that to an LLM, I will get an answer. How the answer is composed, we don't know, right? And if maybe like the whole advertising model goes away on the internet, then maybe whatever gets suggested to me in the LLM is whoever paid most to the provider. I don't know, or did particularly good optimization to be shown in the model, right? So, but there's genuine financial interests at play as well, right? And then maybe that's just pizza, maybe that's not so concerning, but there could be some distortion of markets in terms of consumers not finding the best products for the best price, but paying much more than they have to, and that would cause economic harm. That would potentially, that would arguably lead to money wasted. And I do struggle with, what we do about it, right? Like, And I mean, for me, it brings me back to this question of like, how can we figure out what's going on inside of these models? And as I said, there's some EU laws that are trying to take a stab at that. One thing that I find quite interesting, I'm not quite sure. I don't know if that's the way to go. If I want to publish an app on the Chinese App Store, if I want to register my app, as far as I'm concerned, you have to share at least some of the code behind your software with the regulator, right? You don't have to necessarily share everything, make everything, and you don't have to make everything public, but it has to go into some place, and then it can be looked at. And trying to get more of a sense of what's the data going in there, what is actually happening, what is the code behind it. I don't think that's being done enough. That say, not even under the EU AI Act, there's lots of documentation obligations, but it's not at the level of we go in there and make sense of it. It's more like, well, you report something and we can look at that. So I'm quite, and this is what I'm, this is what I'm hoping to in my job, that hopefully I can educate some people to be able to answer these questions, right? Computer scientists to know about legal questions like yourself, Carolyn, lawyers who have more technical skills. I think that could be a real game changer in terms of understanding those systems deeply, being able to ask the right questions, and then working in regulators, working as lawyers, developing the case law, holding companies to account. I'm not quite so sure, right? Sometimes people say, well, I'm going to work for the big tech companies and change from within. I'm not quite sure if that's working out. But yeah.
I would love to piggyback off of what you just said, actually, in terms of this regulation. So the US is a regulated monopoly, right? People love to believe that it's a totally unregulated monopoly, but the fact of the matter is antitrust enforcement has actually been very strong recently. And that's how you get, for example, Google search found as a liable monopoly. You have the US versus Google in ad tech. For the App Store, you have Epic versus Google. So anyone can bring an antitrust suit and demonstrate monopolistic behavior. And in that case, actually, one of the remedies for Google's monopoly over the Android App Store was to allow access to code. And so I will say, I just presented a pessimistic view, but actually you've reminded me, right? There are mechanisms in place where when consumer harm is at risk, there are mechanisms that are being pursued. It is a slow process. Is it?
I was going to say, like, we have the US case on Google search monopoly. Google search has had a market share of 70+% for more than 20 years, probably,
Yeah.
right? What is the time frame that we look at addressing? And also the Google search case that was started under the first Trump administration.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a slow moving process for sure.
That's not working.
It's not working at the scale of AI development. Right. I agree that, and especially because one of the tactics in the US is to delay cases or to appeal cases. It is not the perfect system. It is a system that exists, but I think we can do better. I agree.
Yeah, Konrad, your great remarks made me think about another impact of this political economy of big tech, and it's the difficulty to actually convince, recruit, students, future employees in those industries to work against, or at least try to hold big tech accountable instead of just joining them and be in the next cool job of a big tech company, right? That market dominance comes up with a price, and this goes against what we see in research, that most accountable tech is happening bottom up, right? When those NGOs step up, And when those academics like yourself publish tools to help us understand how Android apps and iPhone apps actually respect our privacy, and that bottom-up force might, be gradually eroding because of the market dominance, because of the political economy, because of the settings, and what does it mean from a social point of view to be part of big tech? And this is something I'm a bit disturbed by, I have to say.
I think generally, like I'm someone who has studied data flows in these ecosystems a lot. Study lots, what's happening in mobile apps, what's happening with compliance. At least in mobile apps, there was something I could look at and that I could inspect. If I just have the AI model, it runs on the server, and I have to black box test things, that's really, really hard. I don't know, like there seems to be, right, I love bottom up approaches, right? But it seems like there also is a counter movement. I'm not saying it's intentional, but it seems like the surface, just through centralizing compute, in the cloud computing space owned by, I think, 3 companies mainly, it makes research so much harder.
Yeah. The black box methodology, right? When we just use inputs and outputs to understand system behavior is becoming more and more challenging. I agree with you.
But it's not, that's often said, but I don't think it's a black box, right? I think it's a black box by design. These companies
By
know a
design.
lot about, like people often invoke this it's a black box. There's something we can do about it. There's lots of things we can do about it. We just don't want to do the things that we could do.
Yeah. Konrad, we got you angry. That means we're doing a good job. Okay, I see some questions from the audience, but I still have 2 more questions for both of you, and then we can move to the audience, I promise. So, like we haven't had enough, I want to throw another risk to the table, and this is the increasing reliance of those LLMs in writing code and developing software, right? So DeepSeek showed impressive capabilities for supporting developers. Google recently announced that more than 25% of Google's code is written by AI, which is, I think, crazy. How should we regulate those systems that produce code, right? What should we pay attention to? Can, these outputs, code outputs, actually introduce maybe security risks at scale for software development? How do you see this aspect?
I've got many thoughts. Maybe the first association is there's been a long debate on like just regulating the software profession generally, right? Should there be some certification scheme for code? You can only be a coder if you've, I don't know, like a medical doctor, have sworn an oath on upholding ethical standards. At least there, I think there's a couple of problems, such as, I don't know, like code travels borders really easily. So I surely can do these things in one country, but is this really going to move the needle if then people go elsewhere and work from there? I'm not so sure. And then I'm also not quite sure if at least when you want to regulate what code can be written, whether it's by a human or an AI, we have a good grasp of what is unethical or non-ethical or unethical, right? If it's a medical doctor, if someone dies, then maybe something went wrong. But the harms by software, they exist, but they're often less immediate, and then I think it can get quite tricky in terms of what are we regulating here, right? So to me, it appears to, I'm sure you can do something, but to me, it appears to be a difficult field to regulate, if code travels borders so easily, and if maybe we don't really know what is good, what is bad. And also seems to me, at least right now, code may be generated by AI, but there still is quite a bit of interactions with humans who look at things. Whoops, did my video just drop?
No, you're still good.
I'm still good. So you know, then and there's been studies on that in more safety critical code, right? Back in the days, people were using online fora to share code snippets like Stack Overflow when it came to encryption code or more safety critical code, and you just blindly copied that from online fora. That was quite often not following the latest standards, but there were pretty robust feedback loops, right, on these online fora where people could discuss and point out things. And I miss that a little bit in AI-generated code, the feedback loop, that you can bring in the experts. And probably also the context matters, right? If I work on something safety critical, then maybe, maybe I don't blindly trust the AI. If I write a website, just want it to look pretty, then maybe that's a different thing. So yeah. So there's risks, but I do find it quite difficult to think of it as something to regulate right now. I don't know what you think, Carolyn.
Yeah, I think you brought up something about individual accountability and like the ethics or the idea of an individual being responsible for the code that they write. The cybersecurity industry has somewhat addressed this with NIST standards and ISO standards, where an individual who is responsible for corporate cybersecurity is only under very, very rare circumstances actually individually liable. There is a lot of infrastructure and regulation to make sure that the company is the one that takes on liability if, for example, there is a data leak, right, or a cybersecurity breach, which I think is generally good, right? Individual protections are good because they do protect against a potential situation in which the employer has nefarious goals, but an individual is kind of doing the best with what they have. It recognizes that the employer is the one with power in that situation, and an individual can be coerced to do things that they may not wish to do, or they may unknowingly do. And that's why we have certifications for certain individuals as well. But there is kind of a precedent for that, for the idea of should we certify people or make coders take an oath of ethics, which I am very tickled by. I think that in terms of Google saying that 25% of their code is AI generated, is that good? Do we like that? That's bad. That's a bad thing. I think there's an article in The Economist just recently, and then you see things coming out as well where it's like people who are using these AI tools get a boost in productivity, but then that's kind of where the end of the evaluation has happened so far. And then, yeah, you have junior devs who are complete whizzes at churning out code, but then you ask them for a deeper understanding of something and they just don't have it. And that's not a dig on junior developers. That is a statement of what people are being asked to do and how people are being evaluated. Is it problematic? Absolutely. And I think that, again, it's at the application space is where we need to be regulating. And so, for example, safety critical things like autonomous vehicles or aviation, again, grid infrastructure, those are things that need to have much more robust testing than I don't know, than like Instagram, right? And what the algorithm shows you. Although I say that, and I've also just above, I've said, well, misinformation is really problematic and we need to address it kind of systemically. So I think that I don't know if there's a chance to regulate the code that is output. I think that there is less of a chance of regulating that than the language that is output. But I do think that it's a concern. But again, as you pointed out, this code has flaws, and the companies that are using these tools to churn out code do not want their codes to have flaws. And so I think that this is actually something that, as these tools get more sophisticated and more people become familiar with them, I think this might be something that comes out in the wash, that code will get...
Yeah, there seems to be vested interest, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's aligned on not writing bad code. So...
Yeah. I think the impact of AI writing code is still unclear. It can go many ways. I think, like both of you said, you know, the fact that the AI is producing something that might be vulnerable at the end of that tunnel is problematic and might impact the wide spread of software deployments. But at the same time, it can make code more efficient and actually more secure. So from a security point of view, I'm not sure, but definitely something to look at. Okay, we have a little bit less of 20 minutes. I'll save my last question to be kind of a concluding question because I want to make sure we are covering all the questions from the audience. So the first question we had from Sakshi was about the DSA. And let me see if Sakshi would like to ask the question, or either I can ask that as well. So Sakshi, feel free to jump in. I just give you permissions, but the question is, how is the compliance of DCA that Konrad mentioned in his opening remarks coming along in the EU, right? Similar to DMA, the Digital Markets Act, are there non-compliance investigations already for the DSA as well?
Yeah, obviously it's a moving field, but you know, we're seeing quite a bit of litigation going on. I think the example of the Romania election that I mentioned, the presidential election, one of the tools that the European Commission has under the DSA is to request information from the online platform, in this case TikTok, you know, on the issue. So that's what the European Commission did right after there were these concerns about Russian interference in the Romanian presidential election. So you know, it is a tool being used, but there's lots of issues as well. So there's, you know, there's something that's called a DSA transparency database that is supposed to give an overview of you know, all the content moderation decisions that are made in terms of deleting content from online platforms, give insights into the reasons, but then, you know, what platforms do apparently is, instead of giving a reason, they say, well, it was a violation of our platform policies, and then you don't get so much insight from that. There's lots of things to figure out. But yeah, it's a tool being used, and I'm very well, I'm reasonably optimistic about it.
Okay, Carolyn, do you want anything to add about the DSA?
No, I was just gonna say I don't have much to add. I think I agree. We haven't seen much, but we've seen a lot of starts. But it's I think that I don't see any reasons to be pessimistic yet.
Okay, next, Uzi, I would like to take your question because the previous participants who asked questions, I cannot see them in the list anymore. Uzi, do you want to go ahead and ask your great question?
Thank you. This discussion is part of this new institute AIM, which is meant essentially to grow the understanding of AI at the University of Maryland. Carolyn made the comment that most people, or a large majority of people, do not understand what LLMs, for example, are about and their powers and limitations. Konrad also made a comment on the importance of education. So my 2-cent worth is critical thinking by a broader population can be a good way to balance many of the risks of AI. At least in the US, where other regulation approaches are less likely to work. And given the mission of AIM, as I understand it, the question is there a way, a more specific way of educating better a growing part of the population, starting with students, but developing models to do it in a broader fashion, so because humans with their critical thinking are possibly an effective way to balance some of the risks. That's the end of my question.
I have some, yeah, do you want to go first? I have a quick response. Like, I completely agree that education is super, super important. One thing that I actually find quite interesting about the AI Act is that AI literacy is one thing that is emphasized quite a bit in the Act. It's one of the core principles. But you know, I do wonder what does that mean? How you do that? How do you teach critical thinking?
Yeah,
I think we all agree on that. But what does that mean? Like, how do we like? I don't know.
Yeah, I can jump in. I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. So I think myself, like, certainly everyone in this audience is very interdisciplinary. So I've worked a lot with psychologists, and particularly on belief modeling and behavior change modeling. And I agree that critical thinking is very important, and it is something that that is not necessarily as emphasized in the US in a lot of places and circles, right? There's rhetoric around around what is a fact and what is not, and misinformation that is very deeply ingrained in current US kind of zeitgeist, and that's problematic. But I actually would say that the bigger issue is, again, trust. And in terms of how do we go about educating people, number one is you get people to listen to you, and that is something that we do not have a baseline of right now. And so I think that there are certain things that feel very attractive, or have felt very attractive to me in the past as an academic, around implementing belief models and like theory of mind training. How do you teach critical thinking? Much more important does that person give one single hoot about what you are saying and what you're trying to teach them? And the majority of people that I think would benefit from this, from my own perspective, are people who are not interested in that knowledge. So I would say we need to back it up to, how do you get people to be interested in discerning, you know, fact from fiction? And I think most people would say, well, I am interested, and I think I do have facts. And so I think that the real foundational issue is one of trust and one of empathy building. The way that you do that is through communities, right? So you get someone who already has trust, and you get them to deliver the message, or you kind of convert people slowly. It is something that happens everywhere along the spectrum. So people who are radicalized have stuff to do. People who are like really unsure have stuff to do, right? It takes everybody coming along. I think that there is appetite for understanding these systems. It's just people's end goal and what their vision of understanding looks different. So it's about building that shared foundation in a way that is not hostile, is I think the first step.
My thinking is that liberal arts have shown many ways of teaching critical thinking. If you are aware of the great book methods that came from University of Chicago and is being advanced by St. John's College, I have participated in some of them, interestingly. You know, you're supposed to read everything before class, and then a PhD in philosophy devotes the whole time of the class to debate, where people, in almost a Talmudic way, they contradict one another as a way of learning. So this model exists. Now, I think you raise an excellent point, Carolyn, when you talk about why people would care to develop them. I think that if you bring them some examples of where they are taken for a ride because they were too naive and didn't bother, and make some fuss about it that even tabloids can do. You can put them take them out of their zone of comfort and make them start moving.
I think that's, sorry.
I don't know. It's not that I have a curriculum of how to achieve that. But I think that it invites a pretty interesting direction that I think can allow institutions such as AIM even to put itself in a leadership position, because this is needed. People will probably recognize, at least among the professionals, that it's needed. So I think there is room to develop such a model. But my thoughts are too much at their infancy levels.
Thank you, Uzi. I want to be mindful of the time. Carolyn, do you want to quickly respond? And I want to get one more question from Miles after that.
No, that's okay. I think I'd love to, I'll connect with you afterwards though. I think this is a really important and fascinating topic. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Uzi. Okay, Miles, I see your hand. Do you want to ask your question? Or do you prefer me to read it? Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask the question. Miles, are you with us? Okay, so Miles is asking, what do you think about the role of the open source community on governance, right? Given that they have created models and functions that level the playing field, right? Such as Perplexity R1 removing the DeepSeek refusal to respond to sensitive topics, and Hugging Face reverse engineering OpenAI's deep research in just 24 hours. Miles, feel free to jump in and add more points if you would like, but over to you, Konrad and Caroline.
I can speak to this, but I've been speaking a lot. If you have a response, Konrad.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think again, open source is a total misnomer, right? It doesn't mean the same thing as it does for open source software. You're not seeing code. You're rarely seeing training protocols. In terms of what are the impacts of governance, I think again, you run into this issue of competition and who should have access to what. I guess I'd be interested to hear if you have a refinement on governance, right? Should things be required to be open sourced? You see some of that again through the EU AI Act regulations on what needs to be published in order to evaluate a model. If models need to meet certain benchmarks, I think it's very important that auditing of those models is public and publicly available to ensure that they comply with, for example, safety standards. I guess there's a cybersecurity concern that sometimes comes up, but actually the cryptography industry has kind of solved that in a way, or is a model for solving that, where there's this big argument over whether security should be open sourced and security algorithms should be open sourced back in kind of like the 90s and early 2000s, and then they are open source, and as a result everything is safer because you have the benefit of the wisdom of that community. You sometimes see that argument invoked in AI as well, saying, well, we should open source our models because then any security vulnerabilities will be widely accessible and we can kind of debug them together. And that's kind of like the rising tide, all boats argument. I'm not sure that governance has a role here yet. I think that mandating anything to be open source is you run into IP law, and that's kind of true of everywhere, right? If Google published their algorithm and their ranking algorithm, then you would run into problems that Konrad brought up around, well, people can just pay to play, right? Pay for eyeballs, which is what happens, but there's a little more nuance to it now. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but those are kind of the thoughts that I have around governance and open source in this domain.
Thank you, Caroline. Konrad, anything from you on this one?
No,
Okay.
nothing to add.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. Thank you both for the wonderful insights. We have 5 minutes, so let me ask kind of the maybe concluding question, takeaway question, right? Which is, how can we improve the way we regulate AI? Like if, I don't know, 3 things we can do tomorrow morning that if they, had happened, will happen, we will be at a better position of regulating AI. Like what, practically can happen to make those policy cycles more effective, right? To make those high-level AI frameworks really effective and really leading to a change for the sake of the public interest and users of those systems.
Well, I think big thing that I work on in my research is this problem of measuring compliance, pointing out the under-enforcement of existing rules. Right. Also, Carolyn said, oh, there's lots of rules already around. They are getting clarified in case laws, but it also takes a bit of time. Narrowing that gap between the technology and the existing laws is something where we can definitely do something. And where there's potential in making things at least somewhat safer, right? I don't know. We have privacy laws all over the place. They are not respected by these LLMs. We have IP law all over the place. We can argue about whether IP law is suitable for LLMs, but it's been massively violated, potentially violated, and other things. But so we actually have quite a few laws that could be applicable. And if there's interest of taking things one way or the other, we can do something, surely. Also, competition law. Carolyn, you mentioned competition law. It's another vehicle that we have, which has 100+ years of precedent. Surely we can do something. If we're really concerned about concentration in the AI sector, then I don't know, wake up the cloud companies. I don't know. For example, there's lots of things you can do if there's political will.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would add to that, right? What can we do right now? I think establishing clarity on liability. And I will say, I'm sorry that these are not kind of individual actions that we can take, but establishing clarity on liability is one of the number one things we can do. So who is liable at a company? Who is liable? This is something that we see is that when push really comes to shove, when an individual could be held liable, suddenly everything starts complying, everything starts working, right? When the CEO could go to prison, wow, wouldn't you know it, the pieces fall into place. So clarifying liability for these areas where laws could be applicable, I think is great. And then I totally agree. I think establishing frameworks. So just establishing a framework for accountability, or just a generally applicable evaluation process for things like bias, things like accuracy, basically a fit for purpose evaluation framework that we can use to actually compare models. Not only do I think that would be good for competition, because people would have true benchmarks and you couldn't just say our model is 2% better on this random little benchmark that we found, which we are seeing emerging. I think maybe that is an individual action or an individual research kind of item that I know that the Tech Policy Institute has pursued, is comparing these evaluation frameworks. I actually think that is an underrated and pretty powerful tool that, if implemented properly, could become a legal standard, or at a minimum could become kind of a proxy, right, like a competitive standard that would have some pretty powerful impacts.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you both so much. It's exactly 2:30. We couldn't ask for a better opening for our speaker series. So thank you, Konrad. Thank you, Caroline. Please join us, all of you, in 2 weeks for our privacy and criticism session. And we are here. Sign up to our newsletter, be part of our listserv, and we want to hear from you. And we want to be able to serve the community well in these pressing tech policy issues that, like we all saw, impact our lives in so many dimensions. Thank you so much, and see you in 2 weeks.